So welcome everyone. I am just delighted to be here, and thank you so much, Leah, for arranging this. I've really missed connecting with you. Leah, and I know Leah and her family from way back when she was a student here, so great to connect with you and to people from all around the world. Today's class, we're going to focus on forgiveness, and I would like to begin by sharing something very personal around forgiveness. I just came out of the first year of mourning for my father, Shalom ben Shabtai, of blessed memory, and I have shared with people that we did not have an easy relationship. I don't know that anyone really does have an easy relationship with their parents. Always complex, but it's a story that pertains to forgiveness. And as you'll see later, I'll speak about the correlation between teshuvah, repentance or return, and forgiveness. But my father, Oliver Shalom, was an architect, and he designed a home when he was in architecture school. And those plans happened to be bought and the house was built. And a number of years later, my parents moved into that house. And there was an interesting wall in the house that kind of curved. The wall that was a part of the dining room, behind it there was a study, and there was this curved wall. And I remember being about 7, looking up at my dad's drawing board. And in those days, it wasn't online. There was this huge drawing board with the blueprint paper. And I knew that he was working on plans of the house, but it didn't mean anything to me. And suddenly standing there, I realized that my father was working on a plan of our home, and that there was a map, and that I was standing in this specific place on that map. And I said to him, we are here. And I remember my father looked down at me, and he took me under my chin. And he said to me, yes, we are Maini. He used to call me Maini. Yes, we are Maini. Clever girl. Anyway, recently I was with a gathering of some people, and, I shared how that idealized state that a child has in relation to a parent is lost. It's like having to leave Eden after the first Shabbat. It's a part of individuation. It's an important part when we become dissatisfied with our parents. And, they probably have more difficulty relating to us, depending on who they are as we individuate. And we went through many years where there was quite a tumultuous relationship. I lived in America. I had been here for 20 years. My father had been here twice. He came once when I got married, and once for my son's bar mitzvah. And then when my son got married, he came, and I'm not going to go into the whole story about how there was resolution. It was actually through a teaching of the Or Chaim on honoring our parents, where I came to understand something very profound about my relationship. I'll just share the takeaway, which I do with many people, which is that our parents are the parents of our body, and God is the parent of our soul. The Holy One, blessed be He, is the Father, and the Shekhinah is the Mother. And somehow that just facilitated so much forgiveness in my heart, where I wasn't holding my parents to be something that they weren't. They were never going to be God to me. I took that power back into my own being. And anyway, my dad came for the wedding, and it was a wonderful trip. And then he came for the birth of my first grandchild. And then he came again. He came 3 times in 2 and a bit years, or 3 years, I think. I can't remember, but something like that. And he was here in the living room right here. And I said, Dad, I think I became your favorite vacation destination. And he looked at me, and he touched my chin. And he said, yes, you did, Manny. Clever girl. And I tell you, I was flashed back to being that child who was 7 years old, telling my dad that I got that his plan was actually a map of our home. there was a very profound moment for me, a moment that embodied forgiveness, which was that this is my experience. It was told to me by a friend of mine. She's a really wise person. I won't quote her. She's extremely humble and might not like it, but I'll share it. She said, when a relationship goes sour, it never really goes back to the way it was. It either is in a more cold and icy place, or it becomes warmer and richer and deeper in its connection. So, I really felt that moment standing here in my living room with my father, Oliver Sholem, that there was something that was so deep. There was a healing. The second praise was in some way deeper than the first. That's the power of forgiveness. And when we speak about forgiveness, I am reminded of a story of Rav Saadia Gaon, which of course also relates to the idea of teshuvah, repairing what is lost and fixing up our past, which is that our greatest regret is not for what we do, but for what we have not done. In surveys of the elderly, their greatest regret is not that I did this wrong or I did this wrong, but primarily what we have not done. And the story is told about the Gaon, Rav Saadia Gaon, that he was traveling, I think he traveled incognito, and he was hosted by someone who didn't know who he was, treated him very well, but had no idea that he was this great tzaddik, the righteous individual. And when he took leave, someone in the neighborhood saw the host saying goodbye to Rav Saadia, and he came over and he said to him, wow, how lucky you are that you were the host of such a great person. And he said to him, what do you mean? And he said, you don't know who your guest was? That was Rav Saadia, the tzaddik, the righteous individual, Rav Saadia Gaon. And he was just shocked. He couldn't believe that this is the person who had been staying in his home. And he ran off down the street running after the tzaddik. And he called him and he said, forgive me, please, forgive me, forgive me. And the Rebbe said to him, what are you asking for forgiveness for? And he said, for the way I treated you. He said, well, there's nothing to apologize for. You treated me very well. And thank you so much. And he said, yes, I know, but if I had known it was you, it would have been so different. And Rav Saadia said that this story impacted his entire life. That with this consciousness of repairing our life and finding a new way forward is not just about fixing up our mistakes, but fixing up what we haven't done. The gap between where we are and what is possible for us is proportionate to our happiness. The bigger that gap, let's say, it's an inverse proportion. The bigger that gap, the less happy we are. And somehow, when we see what is possible, when another person gets us, or we witness what we haven't done, or where we have withheld forgiveness to someone else, there's so much pain, we cry. People laugh when they recognize the truth, and they cry when they witness the gap between where they are and what is possible. So let's get into this idea of forgiveness. I have a couple of other stories that I want to share, and of course insights. But let's begin by looking at the cost of bearing a grudge and the benefit of forgiveness. So here are some interesting facts and statistics. Well, one is that resentment, bearing a grudge, brings bitterness to new experiences. Now, if you look in the Torah portion of Kedoshim in Leviticus, there are a series of commandments that help us move from being resentful to loving another. It's a process, and we can try and get into that later in more depth, but we're told, don't hate your fellow in your heart, and don't take revenge, and don't bear a grudge. You have to rebuke your fellow. When you do it in a way that's sensitive. Don't put a sin, don't put a sin upon him. Rashi tells us that is, be careful in the way that you rebuke someone and tell them that what they've done is wrong or has been offensive to you. Don't shame someone in the process of trying to rectify what has gone wrong. And then ultimately, we can come to love your fellow as yourself. So it starts with don't hate someone in your heart. Like, you've got to speak about it. So speak about it, but in a way that is sensitive. Make sure that you're not going to take revenge or bear a grudge. And ultimately, when you follow these steps, you will come to loving your fellow. There's such freedom that comes with that forgiveness when we don't. Resentment brings bitterness to new experiences. It could be something new, but I'm stuck in the past and I'm carrying it with me. It can make us depressed, make us stressed and feel anxious. Bearing a grudge or taking revenge deprives us of our sense of purpose, and it removes us from the present moment. So Rashi tells us there, don't bear a grudge is different from don't take revenge. Don't bear a grudge would be, for example, let's say someone comes to me and says, can I borrow your lawnmower? I go to my neighbor and I say, can I borrow your lawnmower? And they say no. And then they come back. They come to me a little while later and someone says, can I borrow your Mixmaster? And if I said to the person, no, you didn't lend me a lawnmower, so I'm not going to lend you my Mixmaster, that would be taking revenge, nakama. Not allowed, that's prohibited. But you're not even, nakama is revenge, natira is resentment. Like, don't bear a grudge against someone. And bearing a grudge is with words, it would be, I would say to the person, sure, you can borrow my Mixmaster. I'm not like you that you don't let me borrow your lawnmower, right? It's kind of showing the other person you're such a lowlife. That is something that we are prohibited from doing. And we are even asked, don't hold this inside of your heart. Work things through with an individual. Now, not always can you work them through, and I am at the end going to come to when forgiveness or seeking means of resolution are not healthy, is not the best thing to do. Nonetheless, even when I cannot work something through with someone else, I am not allowed, I'm prohibited by God from holding that inside of me. So bearing the grudge and not giving forgiveness can make me lose touch with enriching connections with others. I lose my sense of purpose of being in the present, and besides, it's just not the right thing to do. Whereas when I give forgiveness, there's healing power to that, and there's even medical benefits that come with forgiveness. We have lower levels of stress and anxiety, certainly less hostility. We can improve our blood pressure, lower blood pressure, and by lowering our stress. Interestingly, the less vengeful and resentful, I'm using resentful in terms of holding a grudge, natira, a person is, the lower their risk for addiction. So the more resentful a person is, the higher their risk for addiction. There's something about bearing a grudge which gives power to the other individual and deprives us of that. And with that, plus with the need to self-soothe, we raise our risk for addiction. When we manifest forgiveness, we improve our relationships and feel more alive. But the most significant thing from a Torah point of view is that it's the right thing to do. So what is holding us back? Why is it so hard for us to let go and let live? You know, our sages say that the Jewish people by nature, Rachmanim, Baishanim, and Goim Lechosodim, we are bashful. Rachmanim is compassionate. It's connected to the mystical sphere of Tiferet or Rachamim. We are Baishanim, which is bashful or humble, connected to the sphere of Gevura, restraint. And we are goim lechasodim, we are kind by nature, connected to chesed. So you've got chesed, gvura, tiveret, for those who are familiar with the tree of life. We are naturally this way, and it is expected of us to forgive. There is a story in Tanakh, in the Bible, about a group of people who would not forgive. And David HaMelech, King David, said, I have questions on the Jewishness of these people. And it was found out that they were descended from converts who had not converted according to Torah law. They had assimilated, but not converted properly. And this is given as an example by the sages of the fact that it is natural for us to forgive. So why is it so difficult? That's what I would like for us to explore right now. So I'm going to invite everyone, and I'll actually take a moment for everyone to jot some ideas down. I hope that you have a pen and paper nearby, or you can just think to yourself. To write down where you're working on forgiveness in the following arenas. A, with yourself. Where are you struggling with forgiving your own self? It is vital that we put ourselves on the list, and I do not mean in the sense of, just being indulgent and not working on ourselves. We hold ourselves accountable often as a psychological defense, and I'll get into that later, but I'm asking you to just jot down for now where you feel that you are struggling to forgive yourself. What do you need to forgive yourself for? Then, number 2, towards someone else. Where are you struggling with offering forgiveness to another person or to others in general? Maybe there's a pattern or a theme. From someone else, where are you seeking it if it's not, and it's not forthcoming? I have needed forgiveness, or wanted, let me say, I have wanted forgiveness from people who are unwilling to give it. And the Rambam tells us in the laws of forgiveness, anyone who's on this call, I'll upload this recording to the website with some other handouts that you'll be able to download. So I'll send you an email with that information. But the Rambam tells us that we can ask people for forgiveness, but you don't have to ask repeatedly and repeatedly. It's natural to forgive, and if a person doesn't forgive, then it becomes their problem. So there's a point at which you let that go, and he tells us you have to ask 3 times. It doesn't mean, please forgive me, and the person is like crying or weeping or raging, and I say, please, I'm asking you to forgive me. It has to be on 3 different occasions, and there's time that is passing in between, not at the height of someone else's anger, etc. So where are you looking for forgiveness from someone else? And where is it not forthcoming? And maybe ask yourself why there. Why is it not forthcoming? Is it because your request, your apology has not been genuine, or is it because the other person has a problem? Now, I have my friend, I always quote her, Patrice. She says, it's mental, not personal. I love that line, which is, sometimes it's not about me. It's about someone else. So where are you needing it from someone else, and where do you need forgiveness from God? Obviously, we're not going to have time to do all of that now. So that's the first question. Where do I need forgiveness towards myself, towards someone else, from someone else, and from God? And the last thing I'm going to ask you to do is jot down what you consider to be the biggest obstacle to forgiving and being forgiven. You can actually put that in the chat if you want. I'm going to put up on the screen right now an image of our being in a moment of prayer. I'm going to give everyone 1 minute. And if you have nothing that you want to write down, you can just take 1 minute to ask God to guide and help in this journey of forgiveness. It's not a simple thing. So there we go, folks. 1 minute and I'll come back and take your thoughts on the topic. There we go. So thanks everyone for some comments. Some I got privately. I'm going to read one from a friend of mine from our Tanya class. She says, I'm struggling to forgive myself for inadequate and even bad parenting. I'm struggling to forgive myself for failing to honor God in my marriage, my husband and myself. My biggest obstacle to receiving forgiveness is my own unforgiveness. I can't forgive myself, so I can't receive it. Very interesting. Any of you who have ideas that you would like to, feel free to drop those in the chat. I am going at the end to take some questions. I'll be able to give you the mic, etc. But for now, let's move forward with our with the topics, with the concepts, and then afterwards I'll engage. I'm not going to see if people are dropping comments in the chat right now, but I will get back to it later. The first thing I want to speak about when it comes to forgiveness is what I consider to be almost a global confusion around forgiveness, which is that forgiveness is often perceived as being condoning. Forgiveness is not condoning. Just as judging something or discerning is not identical or not synonymous with shaming. You might judge something, but you're not shaming a person by calling out something being wrong. And when you forgive someone, you're not saying what you did was okay. Wrong is wrong. And I think that one of the things that has happened in the world is that there is, in an attempt to have a utopian ideal, we have run headlong into a space of moral relativism and psychic confusion. And one of the things that I see in my work is that people are literally wronged. Someone may steal from them or slander them, etc. A spouse could cheat on another spouse, and the individual finds it very difficult to address the fact that they were wronged. It's almost like we no longer allow ourselves that psychic space, our own voice, because of feeling guilty. And that is utopianism. We're not yet at a place where Yavola Mavis Minaaretz, that death is swallowed up from the earth, where pain and suffering don't exist anymore. We are in a world where there are wealthier and poorer people, where there is good and bad. In fact, our sages tell us that we live in Olam HaSheker V'Harashom Goyim. This is a world of falsehood, and the wicked prevail in it. You know, there's a story that I often share. It's a medrash that when all the animals came into the ark, they went in 2 by 2 in pairs, unless it was the kosher animals. There were 7 pairs of each, so that Noah could offer sacrifices when he came out. But the medrash says that falsehood tried to get into the ark, and when he came there, So Noah said to him, no, you have to come in as with a partner. So he went off and he found Truth, MS, and he said to Truth, how about we go in together? Because if you don't go in as my partner, you're not going to be able to get in either. We have to go in as a pair. So Truth said, okay, fine, just in order to get into the ark and preserve truth forever, I'll go in as your partner. And she gave Falsehood her cloak. But the Midrash says, as soon as the doors were opened, Falsehood ran off in the cloak of Truth, and he has been parading that way ever since. So very deep idea about the world that we live in. And I think that telling ourselves that we can create utopia by wishful thinking is problematic. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do everything we can to make the world purer, brighter, and holier. That's actually the tagline of my website. Our purpose is to make the world purer and brighter and holier, but to say that we were not wronged when we were, or that we didn't do wrong is wrong. And a beautiful way of thinking or connecting to this, not exactly the same thing, is this. We tend to judge ourselves by our intentions and other people by their behavior. We would do well to judge others by their intention and our own selves by our behavior. And then that behavior, whether it's ours or someone else's, has to be judged against what God wants. That is the origin of morality. There's a very slippery slope when we say we'll take morality into our own hands. You're not kinder than God. Don't try. Don't try to be kinder than God. God has stated that there is, the Rambam says, that there is reward and punishment. Punishment is one of the 13 principles of faith. And somewhere we are not comfortable with that. Melanie Phillips writes in her book, All Must Have Prizes, about this idea that no one should be second best, or you can't have a first because the person who comes second won't feel good, and that there shouldn't be punishment. And she points out how detrimental that has been to the education of children if there isn't punishment. I used to teach in high school and seminary, and I would tell the girls, I'm not running a campaign to get you to like me. I care more about your well-being than that you should like me. And I had students who were really angry with me over the years during class because I enforced certain rules or enacted a punishment. Very rarely, but it happened. In years later, sometimes over a decade later, would come and say, thank you. There has to contain someone, there have to be rules and there have to be consequences to those rules. So this idea that there is no wrong creates very deep damage to our psyche and to our relationships. There's a certain chaos when nothing is wrong that ensues. And then what happens is that in our attempt to establish order out of that chaos, it is very rigid. So, the Talmud says, if you're kind to the cruel, you'll be cruel to the kind. Meaning that you have to contain cruelty. Don't be kind, don't enable it. So that's the first thing that I want to say at a very practical level when it comes to this confusion around forgiveness. So now let's go back and see what are the answers that people might have put down. I haven't looked in the chat and seen anything else, but what you might have written in terms of obstacles to forgiving and being forgiven. One of them is, these are not exclusive, but I'm just kind of hypothesizing. Maybe you wrote down that you're afraid that if you forgive, you won't get your share of goodness. Well, I think that exists for some of us. If I forgive, it's almost like I'm being permissive and I won't stand my ground and get the respect that I need, or I won't get the goodness that comes with being strong. maybe you wrote down that there's a fear of change, possibly fear of rejection, very much fear of shame or humiliation, that if I'm going to forgive, I have to admit that I was wrong, or do I? Is forgiving saying I was wrong? No, as I said, it doesn't have to be, there could be. You know, in the method, if you have a look on my website, shimona.org, there is a free module, it's called Meet the Method, and one of the things that I speak about there is, or maybe it's in the obstacles and steps to healing, I can't remember, but one of the suggested steps is looking at what is my part and what is not my part. They're both equally difficult. What is my part in this dynamic? And then try and own that. And don't own what is not your part. So it could be that you were wrong and I have to forgive you. Forgiveness is for something that someone did wrong. If they didn't do anything wrong, I don't have to forgive them. I just have to grow up and, you know, let my ego not be so easily wounded, etc. But we're talking about you actually were wronged, right? So own your part and don't own another person's part. So there is this fear of shame or humiliation, but I would say that underlying it all is the fear of death. In forgiveness, the inner fear is loss of identity, and the outer fear is that of being wrong, of rejection. And, you know, one of my isms is if it's hysterical, it's historical. Just try and remember that. If I'm just hysterical about a situation and going over and over, what is it bringing up for me about rejection or the fear of being wrong? And what's so wrong with being wrong? Well, there is a death of sorts. You know, when I look at forgiveness, to me, teshuva, repentance or return, forgiveness and healing are synonymous in that they all require a death of sorts. Healing is a return to an original state, and the ill self has to die. The illness, so to speak, dies. And teshuva is a return to our original state. We have to emerge from our own exile. So the outer self, the false self, has to die in order for that inner self to be able to return. Teshuva doesn't mean that you turn over a new leaf. You know, don't become new, become you. Return to who you really are, who you truly are. So there's a kind of a death that has to happen in order to be able to do teshuva. And forgiveness is the same. In fact, it enables teshuva. Forgiveness enables teshuva, even the ability to receive forgiveness from God. I think that it's one of the 12 steps, is become willing. I can't remember the exact terminology. If any of you are familiar exactly, you can put it in the chat. But, you know, writing down what we've done wrong, and then before we make amends to others is become willing to have God accept our defects of character. Very difficult to receive forgiveness if we are not able to give it to ourselves. If we can't feel, in order to forgive, you have to be able to die. It's like an art. And the death is, I understand I'm big enough to fail. The outer aspect is going to die in order for the inner aspect to emerge. That's what happens with healing. That's what happens with repentance or teshuva, returning to our true self. And it's the same thing that happens with forgiveness. So all forgiveness requires a psychic death, even if only in a minor way. It is predicated on admission. So I have to admit that someone hurt me. That's what I was speaking about earlier. I have to admit that I did something wrong, or that I had a part in this dynamic. I have to admit that I have an ego, etc. There are 3 words that are connected. One is todah, thanks. One is hoda'ah, praise. And one is modeh, admission. All those 3 are connected to the name for a Jew, Yehudi, and we are named after Yehuda. Yehuda, Judah, was named Leah, his mother said, Apam Odes Hashem, this time I will praise God. So the idea of praise, gratitude, and admission is that there's the psychic death, or what the mystics call bitul, nullification of the ego. So forgiveness entails bitul, nullification of the ego, just as gratitude and praise do, and the false self has to die in order for that true self to emerge. And I think that that really is the underbelly of what makes forgiveness so difficult. The outer fear is that of being wrong, but the inner fear is the loss of identity. And if we can remember, I'm big enough to fail, it's only an external aspect that is dying so that a deeper, truer self can emerge, then we are able to forgive. Much more to be said on that, but let's move into 3 aspects of forgiveness, and then I want to speak about when not to forgive. So you may have heard the terms slicha, mechila, and kapara. Slach lanu, mechal lanu, kaper lanu, which really is, I would say we could translate that as forgive, exonerate, and atone, let's say. So the first level of forgiveness is that I can let go of the resentment. Coming to understand, look, you may have done something wrong, and there are places where I have been wrong. But that was meant to happen to me. Nothing is by chance. If it happened, it was meant to happen from God. So that's the first level. Slicha, like in contemporary Hebrew, we say slicha, I'm sorry, is just, the apology, but letting go of resentment. Mechila is deeper than that. That's exonerating, which is forgoing punishment. Now, here's an example of where you don't have to, but you could forgo punishment. At a psychological level, you don't want to take revenge on the person when you are meichel them, like forgive me. You just totally let that go. But I want to speak about it from a halachic, from a legal perspective, just for a moment. Let's say someone steals from you, and they are found out. They have to pay not only the principal, but they also have to pay an addition for that keren v'chaimish, right? It would be the principal and a fifth. It could be in a court of law. Someone sees that the defendant, the person who stole, is genuinely sorry. So you could say, you know what, don't worry. I accept your apology. I see that it's sincere, and you don't have to pay me back. Now that is because the money is yours. Even though we are told, liha kesef liha zahav, God says the silver and the gold are mine. He apportioned it to different people differently. And if he gave you money that is yours, the things that you own really do belong to you, even though it's a very interesting notion of property and ownership that Torah has. So you don't have to forgo that, but you could. There's some things that you're not allowed to do that for. For example, with blood money, let's say someone killed another person, God forbid, and then in court they might say, I forgive this person, don't punish them on account of the murder. There are societies where there's something called blood money, and that is that you'll pay the family of the relative who was, have a relative who was murdered. They could come to the other family and they say, the individuals will pay you off, don't litigate this crime. That is absolutely forbidden in Torah law. You're not allowed to forgive that because the life is not yours to forgive. We don't own our own lives. No one owns a life. So, for example, suicide is a form of murder. It's murder of the self, but it's still murder because we don't own. Our life is not our own. So that's at a halachic level. Psychologically, what we're talking about is this thing of just, letting go of needing someone to be punished on my account, or bearing a grudge, like, I hope bad things happen to you. And that would not even be in the halachic realm of punishment. That's forbidden. We're not allowed to want that. So mechila is really exonerating the person. And then there's another level, and that is kapara, which is to atone. Comes from the word to scour or to amend, and what that is letting go of any negative effect that resulted from the original sin. And it is as if that sin never existed. It means I changed my past. That's the power of Yom Kippur. Our focus on Rosh Hashanah is not so much the forgiveness from a Hasidic mystical point of view. It's about coronating the King God. You are the only true existence, and anything that I am is only by virtue of your bringing me into being moment by moment. And I deeply want a relationship with you. I want a relationship with my true self. From that place, we discover that we're big enough to fail, and then we can begin this whole process of teshuvah, return, and forgiveness, until we come to Yom Kippur, which isn't even just about the forgiveness. It's about the kapara, which is I can change my past. Space, time, and soul come together in that moment. It's a singularity of space, the Holy of Holies, time, the day of Yom Kippur, and soul, the high priest, or the high priest in all of us. And we touch that essence like a fifth dimension in ourselves, to the point that it is as if it never existed. And that, when I was speaking earlier about the fact that when a relationship goes sour, my friend taught me, and it has been my experience, they either get better or they get worse, but they never go back to exactly where they were. And I think that what's really useful for us to think about in this respect of these slicha, mechila, kapara, is that forgiveness is not a single action that you begin and finish in a short period of time. It's really a multi-layered process and a very long journey. I mean, we have to be going on that journey and progress towards the goal, and it's allowing ourselves space to move there. So we come to not wishing the person any harm, and even praying for their well-being. It's a very deep way of coming to forgive someone, is to pray for them. And at the most basic level, the Rebbe says you could still be upset with that individual, and you could feel hurt, and you could feel angry, but you find it within yourself not to hope for that person's downfall, and not to want revenge. And then you come to another level where you're no longer angry. And I'll tell you, what Jewish time, I just did this remarkable retreat where we were speaking about time, that there's a way of thinking of time as a line and another of time as a circle, but Jewish time is a spiral where you bring the circle and the line together. And I think that forgiveness always works in the spiral. So, last year I could have forgiven or received forgiveness at a certain level, and I had let go of anger, but this year I want to do it in a much deeper way, right? And maybe I'm not angry anymore, but I still can't relate to you in the way that I did until the argument or the point that it soured, but I can move on and go beyond it, and I'm no longer carrying those feelings of anger. It's mainly the anger and the resentment that weighs me down. And then there is a place of being able to restore the relationship. Now, that's the kapara, where we transform our past. But I want to say that at this level, I do believe that it takes two to tango, and that it's not really possible to restore the relationship if the other person isn't on the same path. The other person has to be on a spiritual journey of evolving and being able to own their part and come. It's so much easier to forgive someone when they apologize. I'll tell you, someone once came to apologize to me, and she had done something that was very hurtful. And I said, thank you so much, I appreciate that. And she went into tears. It was amazing. I think she expected me to say, oh, it was nothing, no problem. But I said, thank you. And, that was an indication of someone just not being on the journey that, I had hoped that they were. And if I had paid better attention, I probably could have read that in the individual. But at some level, I just didn't want to play a game. I wanted her to know that was painful, and I do want you to know that it was painful, and I'm grateful that you said sorry. Now, that brings me to the second last thing before I come to self-forgiveness and our relationship with our parents. I wrote more extensively about this on a blog post. It's on my website. I'll put it here in the chat for those of you who, I see there's a bunch of chats that have come up. I'm just putting this here. It's called The Butcher and the Bone, or When Not to Say I'm Sorry. And, I think that there are times where we have to stop trying, because we might feel compelled to fix something up because we want to be the perfect individual. And it's almost like my forgiveness is not so much about the other individual, it's about me. I'll share a story. I don't remember the tzaddik. This isn't the one from the Talmud that I wanted to talk about, but it's related. There's a Hasidic story about a Rebbe who was traveling, and he came into a shul. And when he came into the shul, he sat down and he began to pray. And there were someone. He was sitting in someone's seat. So this individual came and he said, "Hey, you're sitting in my seat. Get out. Let me sit in my seat." And he said, "Oh, I'm sorry," and he moved out. And then someone came to this person and said to him, "What do you know whom you just kicked out of your seat? That's so and so, the tzaddik, the righteous individual." And he was mortified. He came over to the tzaddik after prayer and he said, "Please forgive me. I did not know it was you. I would never have done it. Forgive me, I beg of you. I didn't know it was you." And the tzaddik said to him, "I'm sorry, I can't forgive you." And he was shocked. He said, "You can't forgive me? How could you not forgive me?" He says, "Well, you said that you didn't know it was me. If it was me, you would never have treated me that way. You thought I was someone else." So he said, "But Rebbe, then how am I ever supposed to gain forgiveness for having been rude?" And he says, "Well, go apologize to the person that you thought I was." And the man says to him, "But you could have been anyone. It wasn't like a specific individual." And he responded, the Rebbe said to him, "Well, then treat every individual as if they're the one that you thought I was." So, this idea of giving forgiveness, do you forgive someone who's important in the community more easily than you forgive someone who's not important in the community? Do you want forgiveness? Do you need it more from some people than from others? It's very difficult, to be in a place where you need forgiveness. I need forgiveness from two people, and it's not forthcoming. And, I'm going to try again this year. But there are some relationships that I've let go, and that has to do with the story in the Talmud. It has to do with one of the sages. His name was Rav, and he had a complaint against a certain butcher. Now, on the eve of Yom Kippur, this butcher didn't come to him, and Rav said to himself, "You know what? This butcher should have come to me to ask for forgiveness. He had done something wrong, and Rav was a great sage." But he said, "You know what, I'll go and I'll calm him down." on the way, he met Rav Huna, one of his colleagues, and he says to him, "Where are you going?" He says, "Oh, I'm going to go and, be mafayes, to calm down the butcher." And Rav Huna says to him, "Don't go." He says, "You will cause his death. He should be the one that is apologizing to you." Now, I think that I don't know if he said it or the sages comment that if you go and apologize to him, he will be punished on your account. But Rav went and he comes to the butcher. The butcher, it's on the eve of Yom Kippur. You can just imagine everyone's in white. And there's the butcher. He's with an axe, a hatchet in his hand, and the head of an animal, and he's chopping it into pieces. And Rav came into the room. He stood, and the butcher raised his eyes and saw him, and he says to him, "You are Abba. Go away. I'll have nothing to do with you." And this kind of contempt that he exhibited, and he hacked at the animal, and when he did, a bone jumped off and lodged in his throat, and he died. It's quite a story, isn't it? I mean, this idea of wanting to rush resolution. Sometimes we don't want to sit with the resolution because we need to be perfect. It's like that individual who wanted to apologize to the tzaddik. "Please forgive me. You I would never have hurt." Well, what about the next person? What about another individual, etc., etc.? And so, where that story, when I wrote that story, I had tried to apologize to someone, I think 14 times. I wrote a letter. I went to her, I said, "I want to say I'm sorry." She later said, "I didn't apologize. I just said I want to apologize," etc. And I had to accept that that person was so guarded and heavily defended that she wasn't going to have a relationship with me, and probably with many other people. And I did come to see how compromised her interpersonal relationships were with other individuals over the course of time. So sometimes, Rav and Rav Huna come to teach us it's better to let things sit, allow the time to pass, pray for the individual, forgive them in your heart, but don't expect forgiveness from others yet. And sometimes, I see that someone has their hand raised. I'll be with you in a second. Sometimes the best thing, a relationship is so toxic that we cannot have forgiveness. And I want to just end on this point. I'm happy to stay on and take questions from individuals. I see that someone raised a hand and there are things coming up in the chat. You can also put it in the Q&A if you like. It's about self-forgiveness. When we are children, we do not have the power base and therefore the ability to hold our parents accountable. And they could do things that are wrong. Our parents could behave in ways that are really inappropriate. And because we need them, we don't name them as wrong. We can't say what they are doing is wrong because it feels too threatening. When you're 3 years old and 7 years old and 9 years old and even 12 years old, it starts to change. Let's say even from 9, the individuation begins little by little, more in our teenage years, and then as adults where we know I can be alone. And ultimately I am alone. Ultimately I am responsible for myself. So that individuation happens when physically we can survive on our own. I remember being actually at the European Jewish retreat that Leah ran, hearing Rabbi Lau and the chief rabbi of Israel, and he spoke about being a 9-year-old child. I think he was hidden by his brother in the Holocaust. And it struck me how, a 9-year-old, he needed his brother. Younger than that, the children didn't survive, unless they were hidden children under the care of an adult. But you don't have the smarts, the savvy to be able to do that when you're younger. And so what happens when we are very young is that we own the bad, and we exonerate our parents, but not from a place of health, from a place of vulnerability. And then when we maturing requires that I'm able to allow my parents responsibility for their part. And as I said, that thought that my parents are the parents of my body, not of my soul, is very liberating, because I can see them just as another person, be grateful for the gift of life, and then move on. But I don't have to own the introjected wrong that was committed. I've worked with women who have experienced, God forbid, molestation from a father, from a brother. Worse, it could be worse, or raging from a parent, abuse, physical, shaming, etc. And even as adults, they're somehow still protecting the mother. It's important to be able to say wrong is wrong. That was not okay. And to reclaim the innate goodness that embodies who we are. All right, so let me come in here. I see someone raise their hand, and I'll have to pull up the participants. I'm just going to see. Okay, lots of questions over here. This is recorded. Yes. Okay. Having trouble forgiving myself for something I did that I know was wrong. It wasn't that I didn't know it was wrong, and it hurt others. That is very difficult. And, you know, that's why I say that forgiveness is like a death. It's sitting with that place. There is a reason. Okay, let's talk about this in two ways. There is a reason for everything that we do. If a person lies, if they're extremely defended and don't allow us in, if someone has an affair, God forbid, you know, there are reasons for everything. Now, understanding the reason doesn't justify the doing of the thing, but it does put it in a context, and we have compassion. You know, I was speaking to my son this morning about this, and I asked him about the Gemara. I think he sent it to me, but it didn't. I didn't see the text in time. The Talmud teaches that God wanted to establish the world on justice, on tzedek, but he didn't. He had to forgo that. The world is not established on justice. It's established on Olam Chesed Yiboneh. It's founded on kindness, and he had to have forgiveness and repentance come into the world, because otherwise the world could not stand. We are not, don't be firmer than God. God forgives us and also needs to exact a punishment. So let me, you know, when we do the work of the bitul, of the nullifying of the ego and the surrendering, then God doesn't need to punish us anymore. There's a very interesting verse in Psalms that King David says, and we say it at night before we go to sleep, my sin is always before me. And the question is asked, well, you know, where's forgiveness? Didn't God forgive him? That his sin is always there. But it's the idea of the spiral that I was sharing, which is that I came to a new place, you know, and where I am today, what I did yesteryear is very painful. I have something that's so minor that happened with my mom, but it embodies ingratitude. She came, and I to America, and I'd asked her not to bring anything, and she brought a whole suitcase of things. And you know, I was living in this tiny one-bedroom apartment where I could hardly breathe, and had no space, and I was always giving things away or throwing things out. And I came in, and there with the dining room table was just bedecked with all of her gifts. And she was so happy to give that to me. And I said, Ma, I told you not to bring anything. And every time I think about that, it's like, I just, I want to take that moment away. I have tried to make amends for that and really make sure that I express gratitude to my mother. So I would say try and embrace the mini death, kind of embracing the fact that I did a wrong and that repentance is a never-ending spiral. And also understanding the context, asking yourself, where did that wrong come from? I knew it was wrong and I did it anyway. One of the things I find useful, you can see more about it on the website, it's in a module called Tribe Work, where I speak about the different parts, is that there's a part of me that knew it was wrong and there's a part of me that needed to do it anyway, right? So there's a part of me that knew it was wrong and didn't want to do it, and there's a part of me that knew it was wrong and didn't care, like not didn't care, but needed to do it. Try and sit with that part, understand that part, and see where it is coming from. Carmen, I see, said, yes, it is, but I'm not sure what that was related to. Yes, recordings going out. If you are not on my mailing list, whichever email you registered with is the one that is going to receive an email. I'll add you to the mailing list so that you can get this recording. And if you don't want to be on the mailing list, you'll just let me know and I'll remove you. Is there a link for the story of falsehood and truth entering the ark? There is. It is a story in the Midrash, in Bereshis on the Torah portion of Noah. So you can have a look. I don't remember exactly the page reference, but it's in Bereshis Rabbah on the Torah portion of Noah. Okay, sure, my pleasure, my pleasure. Okay, I'm just mentioning people's. Maybe I won't mention even the first name before I read the question. Does that mean if you know someone needs to apologize, and in this case, I know they regretted what they did, but so far I've not directly apologized, that I shouldn't approach them to make it easier for the fear that they will be judged more harshly? I almost want to say that I take responsibility for what I may have done to trigger what they did, which was undebatably wrong. That is a deep question. And, I would not be able to say categorically, the one way or the other. It sounds to me that there's a lot of, psychological dynamics, relationship dynamics that are underneath that, especially when you want to say, I want to take responsibility for what I may have done to trigger it. Yeah, we do have to own our part, but always remember that we are not responsible for another person's thoughts or words or behaviors. Ultimately, you could have a part in it. I mean, I could tell you some things that the sages or rabbis say that would be very triggering. For example, that if a boy acts out in a way that he shouldn't, they're speaking about it alone in terms of masturbating, and a woman has been dressed very provocatively and sexually, then she has a part in that. I know that that's, from the topic of masturbation not being wrong to the way that women dress and their freedom of expression, there could be so many triggers just in that statement, but I mention it as an example of saying, yeah, we do have responsibility in terms of creating an environment, but ultimately freedom of choice is given to every person. If you feel that the relationship could be healed, you may want to broach the subject with the individual, but don't do it because you want to save them from themselves. And I would think about, is this person able to forgive? Sometimes it's useful to send someone in your stead All right, let me see. There's a bunch of questions and a lot coming in, folks. So I don't know that I'll get to everything. I'm going to put a cap. I'll take 2 more questions and then the raised hands. How can I forgive myself for making a series of wrong choices I justified at the time because I wasn't honest with myself? Now looking back, I'm so angry at myself for not being true to what God intended me to be. It took a long time to see that. I feel betrayed by myself, and I keep wondering if God will forgive me. Yeah, very, very deep. I think that that's connected to the question that I answered previously. And just as we need to have this balance in our lives of loving kindness and restraint. My very dear friend, Sarah, is a remarkable potter. Here is a bowl that Sarah made. And the way she makes these bowls on the wheel, pushing out over here and holding over here, is just remarkable. That's how pottery works. It's that kind of holding. You've got to have the chesed that pushes out and the gevurah that brings in. Don't go too much. You get another pair of eyes to look at you and to help you in the specifics of your situation. Sorry. Forgot to turn off my phone. So you want another set of eyes because we can tend to be too harsh or too lenient with ourselves. But it's okay to feel regret. It's okay to feel remorse. Who was it? Rabbi Elazar ben Dordaya, I think it was, who was a very great soul, and he went off and he experienced every pleasure in the world. And on the last day of his life, he realized what he had done and how much he had lost. And he put his head between his knees and he wept until his soul expired. He died from the grief of remorse at what he had lost, at how he had betrayed his own soul. And I do think that that is something that is useful. We have to take our failures, the very deep failures, as an invitation to make amends. You know, how can I do the tashlumim? How can I pay? Not like, oh, you're going to pay for this, but how can I use that as an opportunity to make the world better? As the Talmud says, a person sees from the black of the eye. All right, so I did see that there were 2 participants who had raised their hand, but I am not. Let me see where they are. Okay, Shandor and Mashi. Hi, folks. So first I'm going to give Shandor, allowing you to speak. Shandor, do you want to? I'm just asking you to unmute. All right, so I'm sorry that those people who had raised their hands, maybe it was a mistake or they don't have their mics working. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Oh, got it. The hand was a mistake. Okay, that was just touching the screen. Thanks, Mushy. Okie dokes, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I hope that you found it useful, and do let me know. You can send an email to me personally, Shimona@shimona.org. Please don't add me to any email lists that I haven't requested to be added to, but so great to be on the call, and maybe we'll have a chance to do another one on forgiveness, not on forgiveness, on teshuvah in general. We'll see. I'll speak to Leah, see how that goes, and I'll be in touch going down the line with the recording. Hopefully we'll have it up by tomorrow. Leah, I am thinking that maybe we should just bring you on. Let me see if I can bring you, because Leah is the one who made this all possible. Here we go. And can you, Leah, can you unmute? No, somehow, not sure why. All right, folks, thanks for joining us, and please God, we will see you next time. Bye.